Be sure to subscribe and like our channel.
Welcome. We are back here on Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole podcast, Queen City Curio video cast here every Saturday, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Let's go through our announcements first. First things first is that we have new products made. So if you want new products such as money draw, fiery wall protection, uncrossing oil. We got all that made in the last few days, so we have it fresh off the batches there. Also, in terms of events, we're going to be in Toronto Pagan Pride and Hamilton Pagan Pride in September. And our upcoming events for the sponsors is we're just finishing up our chakra workshops for tomorrow. And then we're going to Western Elementals and then going into the tarot for enchantments and divination. So that's popping up every other Sunday for our sponsors there. So today we have Pierce Salguero. He is a Buddhist scholar. He works at Penn State. He is like the top dog when it comes to Buddhism. I know he's going to humble himself there, but in terms of literature, he is one of the main people you go to. If you have to read a Buddhist book on like any academic sources, he's probably one of the first ones you meet. So he's wrote many books. He has specifically an interest in Buddhist medicine and variations, and then he also is a PhD. So welcome to the show, Pierce. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your bio that I missed?
Hey, thanks, Zach. You're very generous. I wouldn't say I'm a top dog in Buddhism more generally, but Buddhism and medicine is definitely my specialty. Well, I guess the one thing I would just add to what you said is I do have it in a previous life before I became an academic. I had a background in as a practitioner for briefly of Thai medicine, which included massage, herbal medicine, and some kind of like ritual healings and things like that. I know a lot of overlaps with the stuff that you guys are into. So yeah, I was a practitioner. I learned in Thailand when I lived there for about over the course of about 4 years before becoming a PhD. So.
Right.
But yeah,
so,
thanks for having me on. It's great to be
it's
here.
It's a pleasure. So you just released this book recently, right? Buddhish, and it's a book on at least what I would understand to be as the meta concepts within Buddhism. And again, Buddhism's such a big area as a paradigm. So what got you drawn to it first in the first place? Because I mean, given your background that you even said, you're like, well, of all the odds, I end up coming here. So why don't you tell that story for our listeners?
Yeah, so the background of Buddhism, more generally, or the background to the book?
More just your journey to it, because
yeah.
Let's start with you first, and then we'll get into the
specifics. Okay, sure. So yeah, I've I've been interested in Asian forms of spirituality, and among other kinds of things, I was very into sweat lodges and shamanism. Really, from high school, I went to a private school where there were teachers that taught courses like that, and there was a Native American medicine man on our campus, and people doing meditation and yoga, and got into martial arts and was exposed to all of this stuff really early, and got pretty deep into it. As a practitioner, went to college. I took some courses in related things, majored in anthropology and cognitive science so I could study some of these kinds of practices. And then when I graduated from college, I went off to Asia. Up to that point, Buddhism hadn't been the main thing I was interested in. But through sort of a series of accidents in Asia, just kind of like the fates took me to Thailand. And this is kind of where all of my interests kind of crystallized and came together. Like I just mentioned, I lived there over the course of 4 years. I was only supposed to be in Thailand for a couple of weeks, but I very quickly got attuned to both the medical traditions and also the Buddhist traditions, and also this whole sort of rich world of magic and healing and so forth. And so that kind of captivated me, and I stayed, became a practitioner. But all along, even when I was, primarily interested in the practice, I always was interested in the history and kind of the backstory to how Buddhism and yoga and Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and all these different traditions are related. And so that puzzle, how are these related historically, sort of stuck with me over all of those years. And eventually, a fork in the road came where I realized that actually was my primary interest. It wasn't so much the being a practitioner, but actually sort of digging into the history of these practices. And at that point, I came back to the U.S. to University of Virginia, where I had gone to undergraduate. Came back and started graduate school. So that at that point,
That's a whole journey there.
yeah, exactly. I embarked on a really different journey. And it's been about it's been 20 years since over 20 years, 22 years since I moved back. So since that time, I've continued to speak to practitioner audiences, and I did practice briefly when I got back for a couple of years. But more and more, the practice has fallen by the wayside, and the scholarship has been sort of my primary occupation.
Right. Yeah, I know. Like generally, when I was perusing the book, and Andrieh, who can't be with us tonight because of a work obligation, we were looking at this, and the meta concepts and what you described in your book, Buddhish, it really is like why a meta concept book? Like, why not just talk about Buddhism, right? Because there's so many books on Buddhism. So why specifically the meta skeleton?
Yeah. So the book kind of came out of my teaching, both in the college environment, but also I've been teaching, just kind of intro Buddhism or things related to Buddhism and medicine for practitioners as well. Practitioners of Asian medicine, I mean. After decades of teaching, I just have come to kind of be a little bit dissatisfied with the introduction textbooks that are out there, at least the ones that I know, and I kind of perused a lot of them over the years, trying them out. And I feel like the problem for me is that either the books are written by Dharma teachers, and so they're very much coming from a particular sectarian perspective, where they want to, promote the views of their own particular form of Buddhism, or it's a super dense kind of historical, textbook type treatment by a scholar, which is, maybe good for certain undergraduate environments, but not really that readable for just an ordinary person, or increasingly, my courses are sort of 17-year-olds who kind of like, 17, 18-year-olds who may not have any sort of invested interest in Buddhism whatsoever. And so I feel like those books kind of turn people off right away. And so I was looking for a sort of a book in the sweet spot in between, something that was objective, gave you kind of the lay of the land, the big picture, but didn't push a particular viewpoint in terms of, a particular Buddhist sect, or even, that Buddhism is necessarily correct or useful. So I wasn't able to find that book, so I wrote it. And in this book, that neutral position that I just described in between those two.
Yeah, no, it was a very neutral position. I laughed at it when, like, in that renunciation chapter, you guys like, well, I have problems with this renunciation thing. I'm like, I do too, right?
Yeah.
But it's like you're hitting all of the major viewpoints that would fall into the paradigm. And I think even just saying like, well, you have, I wouldn't say a problem with the renunciation, but it's like, well, it just doesn't match your lifestyle currently.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'm pretty honest in the book about, like, I have tried various Buddhist practices. At one point, I described in the renunciation chapter that at one point I did go to live in a monastery in Thailand I was never a monk, but a resident layperson for a couple of months. And I'm kind of honest in the book about just my own personal journey. I don't make, mostly I try to be objective in introducing things, but I do occasionally sort of jump in and say, yeah, I tried that and it did work for me, or actually I got a lot of value out of doing this myself. So I do express my opinions here and there throughout the book, not all the time, but enough to make. I'm going for sort of like a voice that's relatable and trustworthy as a narrator. So I feel like being a little bit sort of open about my own experiences, which scholars don't do at all. So it's a very different kind
So that's why I found, like, when I read it, I was like, this, he gets it. This is hilarious, because that's what I say too, right? But it's like, yeah, I mean, it's a very different mindset between like it's an introduction. You're pretty much like on the ground, laying it down, having a like basically a coffee conversation with people.
Yeah.
Then there's the academic pedigree where they stand on the White Tower. It's like here's all this, and you're like, no, that's not my thing. I mean, I do it, but
Yeah, I try to be relatable. Yeah, so the book is like it's the 20 sort of most frequently encountered concepts, I guess, from Buddhism. And then the subtitle says it's a guide to those ideas for the curious and skeptical. So I try to sort of like play both sides of that coin, stoke people's curiosity, but then also maintain kind of a skeptical stance throughout the book, and allow people to make their own decisions about what to make of all of this. And I don't hold back about kind of introducing some of the negativities, or the negative sides, or the the skeletons in the closet, with Buddhism, as well as the promises and the great claims of of the tradition as well. So
absolutely, and I think that is one of the other pieces I enjoyed about the book. You didn't hold back. I mean, you kept neutral on it, but it's like even things like when you talked about rituals and then the magical cultivation practices around that, you didn't really hold back. You're like, it might work, it might not work, give it a try, but do some research, figure it out, experiment. Right? And I think that in itself says a lot to a reader that's fresh, because it's, as you said, most people would take a philosophical viewpoint and say, well, okay, this is just a nice mindfulness awareness practice. But you said no, it's not by its history and not by its traditions. So you did actually take a stand on that, but you also still kept it neutral. It was like, well, you're entitled to what you're thinking, but this is not part of the paradigm, or this is part of the paradigm, and you can choose.
Yeah. So I definitely was trying to sort of do a little bit of myth busting in terms of kind of the stereotypes about Buddhism, or the sort of the mindfulness kind of movements, kind of self presentation. I tried to sort of I guess debunk or myth bust some of those things, and just kind of leave it up to the reader to decide what they want to do. And so I think what you're referring to with the ritual practices is, in that part of the book, I'm kind of pushing back against. You do find this frequently among mindfulness practitioners, or just kind of like Western Buddhists, or people who don't have Buddhism within their cultural heritage of their family, or their culture. A lot of times we'll say, Buddhism's a philosophy, or it's a way of life, and it basically all boils down to meditation. And that's where I kind of intervene and say, well, hold on a sec, because like the vast majority of Buddhists throughout history have been Asian. They haven't been monastics. They haven't actually exclusively practiced meditation. In fact, like most lay Asian Buddhists throughout history didn't practice very much meditation. It was something that the monks did, but the lay people didn't. And so ritual really has been the primary sort of backbone of the Buddhist tradition for since its inception. So let's not just so quickly brush that under the rug and deny its importance within the tradition. Let's let's learn more about it. So anyway, that's just one example of those kinds of pushing back against stereotypes that I try to do throughout the book. And that's, I guess, the scholarly kind of like edge to the book, right? Is those kinds of parts. But then I also tell stories and tell stories about my own travels, my own experiences, things I saw, relate some Buddhist parables and narratives, legends, and so forth. And just try to make it a fun read with a lot of different dimensions to it, so that it keeps it fresh and moving.
Right. And this is where I would say, like, even in the elucidation of those like parables, legends, and even your personal stories, is there a particular story that really stands out for you?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll say the one story that my students like the most, that they talk about the most in class, is there's a story in the chapter about karma, about these about the birds in cages. So I don't know if you want me to tell that story.
Yeah, go for it.
It's
whatever you want, man.
I mean, anybody who's encountered Buddhism in Asia or temples in Asia more generally will recognize this sort of thing. But you know, the first time I was in Thailand, I came across a Buddhist temple. It happened to be birds in cages that a woman was selling, and there's sort of the tradition, right, where you buy the birds and release the birds, and this is giving them their freedom. So it's good karma, good karmic merit for you to do that. And it's a really common practice, whether it's like releasing fish or turtles or birds or whatever. It's really common practice in Asian Buddhism. So, you know, so I talk about in the book that I came across this woman selling these birds. And then I noticed behind in the back of the temple that her son is collecting birds and putting them into cages and bringing them to his mom. So it's kind of a cycle. She's, you know, selling the birds for people to release them, and then her son is recapturing them, and then she's reselling them, and it's kind of like a cycle like that. And so I introduced that in the chapter. Yeah. So I introduced that in the chapter on karma, just to talk about, so, you know, what would you do in that situation? Or, you know, what should I do in that situation? Here I am in Thailand encountering this for the first time. And I talk about how, well, you know, the first glance, you kind of think, you should release the birds because then they're free, and that's, you know, the act of kindness. But then when you think about when you see the son recapturing them, then you're like, well, wait a minute, I'm just kind of like supporting this whole industry that kind of like creates suffering for birds. So maybe I shouldn't buy the birds. But then, you know, then I start thinking, and I'm like, well, maybe, you know, I'm an American in Thailand. I got like, you know, by definition, I'm wealthy. You know, my dollar converts to baht, you know, in my favor. Why not just buy out all of these birds? Because it's really not that much money, and just send, you know, let the people go home for the day. And then I'm like, yeah, but wait, if I do that, then they'll come back tomorrow with even more members of their family selling more birds, because, you know, it becomes this kind of like, you know, this attractive profession. Anyway, people who are Buddhist or who have encountered this in the past will already kind of know like where they land on the question, should we buy the birds or not? But I wanted to bring this out for the reader, somebody who's new to Buddhism, new to the idea of karma, just to point out that like karma isn't sort of like a black and white kind of, you know, you're on the naughty or the nice list, or you're, you know, it's things are either like good or evil, but karma is more like a framework or a tool to use to think through the ethics of a situation. And you kind of like have to unpack the situation layer by layer, thinking through the effect of your actions on other beings. And so I just use that story as like a way of introducing the concept of, you know, kind of these Buddhist doctrines as being tools to think with, rather than just black and white, you know, things to accept or reject. Anyhow, my students love this story because then we have a big debate in class about what would you have done? And some students, you know, buy all the birds. Some students don't want to, you know, buy the birds at all. And it's a lot of fun to discuss and just kind of like think through ethics from this new standpoint that's less black and white and all about the shades of gray.
Well, absolutely. And I think when you were even discussing certain pieces, you're like, well, this is a reflection on you. Right? Whatever you're choosing is a reflection on you. So if you buy all the birds, or you don't buy the birds, or you hustle the birds, I mean, that's just showing you within the framework of, well, the play. And what you choose is just an illusion anyways, right? And that can be a whole conversation by itself, but just even the choices is showing something of what you're choosing to everyone else, and the interconnectedness.
Yeah, I mean, one of the places I bring that out is in the discussion I just mentioned previously about a lot of people think Buddhism's or they say Buddhism's a philosophy or a way of life.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's why I kind of point that out there. Well, if you think that, that says more about your ideas about Buddhism than it does about Buddhism itself, right? To say Buddhism's not a religion tells me more about you than it does about Buddhism. So, yeah, there's kind of one of those places in the book where I bring that out.
Mm-hmm. And then one of the YouTube viewers was saying they laughed at the compassion piece on when you talked about the mosquito story. So there you go. They even referenced the page specifically for everyone on YouTube. So they're
thanks for reading.
on it.
Thanks for reading. Thanks for reading closely.
Right. So with like, you went to Thai Buddhism. That's a specific type of Buddhism. So this is where it's like when you're learning things about like East Asian Buddhism, we know that's a whole different animal. So how did that conversation go
Yeah.
just in your own learning? Just because I know from a viewpoint they do have very different interpretations on how to practice.
Yeah, totally different. Totally different. Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, my exposure to Buddhism was initially, I mean, I read a book or two or taken some classes before, but really the in-depth introduction to Buddhism was when I got to Thailand, and sort of I came away from those 4 years just with the idea that, oh, this is what Buddhism is, because that's the only form of Buddhism I really knew. But as I was increasingly interested in, like I said earlier, the interconnections between Chinese medicine and yoga and Buddhism and Ayurveda and these other forms of healing around Asia, came back into graduate school. I actually started working on Thai materials, but very quickly into those studies, I learned that the historical record in Thailand is pretty sparse in terms of being able to do a history of Buddhism and medicine in Thailand. It really would be, a modern history, or it would be a contemporary kind of ethnographic study, both of which I have done a little bit of. But I really was interested in kind of the older history, the deeper roots of the movements of religious and medical ideas around Asia. And so, early on in graduate school, I was in a master's degree in East Asian studies. So it was pretty wide in terms of what I could choose to do. So I started working on Thailand, but then gravitated over to looking at some of the Chinese materials. And I discovered at that time, it was right when Michel Strickmann's book, Chinese Magical Medicine, came out in 2002. And when I discovered that book, I was just like, oh my God, this is what I want to study. Because it was very much the same kind of rich array of practices of both religious and medical practices mixed together with magic and demonology and meditation and all the stuff that I was interested in, all sort of tangled together. But it was all happening 1,500 years before the stuff that I was seeing in Thailand. And I just thought like that was an amazing field to get into. Michel Strickmann's book was published after he passed away. And at the time, I sort of like was doing kind of a literature review, and I just saw basically nobody was working on this. And I just saw like an open lane to kind of pick up where Michel Strickmann left off and really delve into the into the subject of Buddhist medicine in China. So I actually, at that point in time, shifted gears, started taking classes in Chinese history, started taking classical Chinese language, finished out my master's degree, and then transferred to Johns Hopkins School of Medicine to do my PhD in the history of medicine department, completely focused on Chinese Buddhist medicine.
Right, and that's where you and me connect on things, because my background is a registered acupuncturist, Chinese medicine professor, and also doing Buddhist work all the time. I'm like, yep, all right, I have to talk to you. And it's one of those things where from the Sino standard, it is interesting to do those cross comparisons, because I know a lot of people like to do comparisons to Tibetan Buddhism specifically. I'm like, no, completely different animal. Don't try to overlay them, right?
Yeah, that's a completely other form of Buddhism and medicine too, right? So, I mean, I do think that these three, so Thai medicine and Buddhism, that mixture in contemporary Thailand, and then like medieval Chinese materials from the first millennium, and then also the Tibetan materials from slightly later, kind of early second millennium. They are interesting to compare.
Well,
but they can't be conflated together as being like, oh, this is all just Buddhist medicine, because the forms of Buddhism are so different and the forms of medicine are so different that they can't just be like clumped together. And so a lot of the work I've been doing in the last like 7 or 8 years has been, or I guess it's 10 now, has been to produce not the book we're talking about today, Buddhish, but my other book that came out this year, which is the Global History of Buddhism and Medicine.
Yes.
It's an academic book that came out with Columbia University Press. So that book and all of the work that's gone into creating that book, all the the groundwork that went into that really has been focused on exactly that question, like separating out these strands of yoga, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, other forms of healing, and then separating out the different forms of Buddhism around Asia, and then sort of demonstrating how they all have historically interacted together.
Right. So if there was like, I know you do the intro classes. However, like for someone just fresh coming into Buddhism, they're like, I heard this because of, I don't know, Western culture. It's pretty prevalent, right? And they have some interest. They're like, karma is bad. You do something bad, it's the judgment. And how do you unwind and unpack this for someone beginning, saying like, what's the simplest concept that you could say to them to kind of give them a feel of what, well, Buddhism as a whole, and I mean it's a big whole,
Yeah. Yeah, well, so I couldn't narrow it down to one. I chose 20.
Sure, I
Right,
mean we got the
for this
time,
book.
so
For this book, I had to choose 20 ideas because I couldn't choose one. But yeah, I mean, what do I say? Well, I think one of the points I make early on in the book, I think is maybe a sort of a point of separation between traditions, and that is that Buddhism, basically almost all forms of Buddhism. There's a few exceptions like Pure Land Buddhism, which is a sort of a different thing, but
it is a whole animal.
almost all forms of Buddhism kind of adhere to the notion that we as human beings have some work to do in cultivating a certain kind of insight, and that this work can't be done for us by anybody else, that we have to take on the task ourselves of working towards gaining those insights. Of course, then they extrapolate that over many different lifetimes, and exactly what insight you're supposed to be working on is different from tradition to tradition and so forth. But the basic idea that like the meaning of life is a self-improvement project of some kind that ultimately winds up with transcending the self, I think is maybe sort of like the headline, the tagline for Buddhism, right? As opposed to other traditions. So I know there's other traditions where God is going to either save you or not, and there's all you can do is have faith. Or there's other traditions where there's other things are the main idea. So that I think maybe that's where I would start with Buddhism, because if you're not into that message, you're not into Buddhism, right?
Right. And
So
then this really gets to a point where it could be contention for some Buddhists. If you got hate mail on Buddhism, send it to me personally, right? So this is where does the ego take place on this? Because I've heard people, generally most people when they think Buddhism is like, oh, you're trying to destroy your ego or you're trying to dissolve it. Then you have like more left-hand path Buddhists, I would say. It's like, no, it's about you transcending yourself and accepting different pieces of yourself. This is why we talk about the sufferings. This is why they will talk about the hells, the different layers for all the devas, etc. Right? So where does that fit in philosophically now?
Yeah, we're kind of getting off into Dharma teaching territory, which I tend not to do. But the point, I guess the point I would say as a cultural historian, as somebody who's like studied all these different traditions, is whatever philosophical position a Dharma teacher would take on that question is directly refuted by like 700 other Buddhists, right, from other traditions. So like, I find it really difficult on basically any point to say like, there's the Buddhist take on this, other than the really general kind of like, self-improvement kind of an ultimate transcendence kind of answer I gave earlier, which even then I said, well, but then there's the Pure Land Buddhists who are different, right? So I just feel like it's really shaky territory to make any generalizations at all about any of this, because there are for sure millions of Buddhists who have a completely different view than whichever view is being expressed on that. So I mean, in terms of the self-transcendence piece of the puzzle or goal of Buddhism, that is in Buddhist terms normally described as realizing that there never was a self to begin with, right? So that's normally the kind of the language that's used about that, and so some of these structures like the ego, other kinds of conventional ideas about self and identity and so forth. Ultimately, in most forms of Buddhism, are things that sort of like are seen through at a certain point in the practice. But they're not usually, you don't usually start by trying to see through those. You don't usually start from the very beginning by like, oh, my ego, I need to overcome it, right? Buddhism is, that's a little bit like cart before horse sort of thing, right? Where Buddhism, would I think most forms of Buddhism would have you start by sort of like putting that question on the shelf and just reflecting or doing meditation or doing some other kinds of practices that sort of like get you started in a more practical mode before you sort of start to kind of grapple with the ultimate questions of philosophy. I had a moment like this in just to go back to storytelling. I had a moment like this for me in Thailand when the very first time I was in Thailand initially in the first year. Where I got interested in staying in a monastery and went to the monastery and was talking with the monks and so forth. And I was like, yeah, I might be interested in staying, for a longer time, but like, I just don't see why, I have to shave my head. I'm a little bit sort of attached to I had like really long dreadlocks. I'm a little bit attached to my dreadlocks, but like, it's just appearances. Like, why does it matter? Why can't I, why would I have to shave my head? I wasn't like challenging their policies, but I just was like curious about that. And their answer basically was like, just don't worry about it. Just go do your thing, do your meditation. Don't worry about it. At a certain point, you'll see that you're not so attached to your hair anymore, and shaving it won't be such a big deal, right? So, so I feel like that kind of answer you could give to kind of the whole question that about like ego transcendence and non-self personality, all that stuff, and that's usually a lot of times that's kind of the obstacle for people who are interested in Buddhism. It's like, oh, I don't know, the philosophy doesn't really jive, and that's fine. If you don't like the philosophy, it doesn't matter. Just you can go elsewhere. But in Buddhist monastic communities and practice communities, I think often the answer would be, well, don't worry about the philosophy. Just put it on the shelf and
just do something.
Just do something to make yourself, a happier person, and whether it's meditation or other kinds of cultivation, and eventually, you'll come to the point where you accept or not the philosophy. Once it becomes relevant, right, then you can start thinking about it.
Absolutely. I think I was watching a documentary, I think it was probably 2-3 months back, and I think it was like a food thing, and a person was basically in Thailand saying like, okay, I'm trying to get some Thai cooking, but then he's taking photos like every monk here is like breaking every single rule that I know Buddhism to be. One's smoking, one's drinking. He's like, and they're all like, whatever makes you happy. We choose our vices, and then we'll get over them at some point too. And he was like, what? So I found that to be funny on that one, just because, again, it's the Western shock where they have this stereotype. But when you go in Asia, it's like, well, do what makes you happy, do what works, whatever that means to you.
Yeah. And then you do have like the super puritanical, moralizing kind of conservative, members of the Sangha too, or orders of the Sangha too, that are like that. So yeah, but I do think on the whole, Buddhism tends to, in my experience anyway, the Buddhism that I've come in contact tend to be, they tend to sort of like appreciate the limitations of where you're at with your own personal practice, your own personal life, and it's not like you're gonna burn in eternal damnation because of breaking a few rules. It's about maybe you'll be reborn in hell a few lifetimes, but then you'll eventually have a chance to do over and keep keep working, right? So it's a little bit more, I think, a little bit more lenient in terms of, or a little less puritanical in terms of in those moral kind of questions usually.
Right, right. And then I know this is a little bit off topic on the book, but this is where when you're generally comparing Asian systems, or at least different types of Buddhism. If you could you give a flavor for the different types? Like, I know there's Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Thai Buddhism, like as a whole. So could you give a flavor for viewers if they're interested? Just because they may be like, yeah, this is nice, we get a meta concept, but I don't know which one is which given their personality, right?
Yeah, I think that's important. And it's important because I mean, one of the things I say early on in the book, one of the reasons for writing the book is, if you're interested in Buddhism and you decide what you're going to do is go to the bookstore and grab a book on on Buddhism, or you're going to go to a meditation group, on Buddhist meditation group. Sorry. Odds are you're going to wind up with one or another sectarian view of Buddhism, right? Just like me, I lived in Thailand for 4 years and came back with a very kind of unidimensional opinion about what Buddhism was about, because that's all I knew, right? And so I think it's better to start with this kind of like broad overview, but which is why I wrote the book, because there aren't too many of those out there that are readable, that aren't super dry academic works. So yeah, one of the chapters in my book, I'm like, okay, there's 4 or 5 major kind of divisions within Buddhism that you should be aware of as a Western person not familiar with Buddhism, wanting to become interested in Buddhism. There's 5 things you should be aware of. So the first one is Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism is practiced primarily in Southeast Asia. Of course, now they're all practiced all over the world. But Theravada Buddhism is the source for a lot of the mindfulness and Vipassana style meditation, more secular styles of meditation that are circulating around in the West today. So it may be of interest for that reason. It is, at least in terms of the monastic practice, very heavily focused on meditation. But at the same time, something kind of like a little bit of a counterpoint is that in actual daily practice amongst lay people, it's just filled with all kinds of magical and occult practices. So for your audience, that might be super interesting. In that form of Buddhism, stereotypically at least, you are your primary focus is on your own personal meditation to become an awakened person. Second form of Buddhism, Mahayana, means the great vehicle or the greater vehicle. And it's kind of like, I call it in the book, it's like maybe I don't call it in the book this, but it's kind of like the big inclusive form of Buddhism that has all kinds of different sects and different kind of groups affiliated with it. So it's very difficult to kind of summarize the whole thing.
That's a hard one to summarize, but I understand.
Yeah, but I would say what distinguishes Theravada from Mahayana, just kind of like some kind of like key points, and that it's not 100% of the time. It's not going to apply 100% of the time, but just to give a flavor, like you said, meditation would be maybe a little bit further down the list of priorities. The first priority is compassion and expressing compassion in the world for other beings, to the point where the goal within that form of Buddhism is normally not to get yourself enlightened, but to work for the awakening of the whole mass of sentient beings. So there's other differences too, like this form of Buddhism, Mahayana, has a lot of deities in it, a lot of different Buddhas and different kinds of bodhisattvas. So Theravada does too, but they tend to be more like angelic beings and spirits and so forth, not Buddhas, because there's really only one Buddha in the Theravada tradition that's really kind of like worshipped or kind of statues, of just really one Buddha. In Mahayana, there's countless Buddhas, and so and bodhisattvas for all kinds of different things. And so this is the this is the tradition that's a lot more kind of theistic in certain respects. Is this too much detail? Should I keep going?
No, this is keep going. I mean,
Okay.
I'm loving it. Listeners, I mean, they're
Okay.
learning about Buddhism and the different flavors, so this is great.
All right. So there are many kinds of Mahayana Buddhism, like I said, and this is practiced all over. Past Cambodia, and even Indonesia were also Mahayana Buddhist. So it's really widespread, and it's got a lot of different flavors. Japanese Mahayana is different than Chinese, different than Mongolian, different than
Oh, it is.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's like tons of diversity in there. But I would in the book I pick out two forms of Mahayana to talk about in a little more detail, because you're more likely to run into them as a Western person without Buddhism in your family or your cultural heritage, and you're looking for sort of an introduction. So these two forms of Mahayana that I pluck out to talk about in more detail are Zen and Tibetan Buddhism. So they're both forms of Mahayana, but they have kind of like they've evolved into their own special sort of categories, I think. So just quickly, Zen starts in China, but it's primarily, at least in the US, maybe in Canada too, I'm not sure. It's primarily found in sort of its Japanese iteration, although it's found in, it's also, you have Zen comes from China, but you also have Zen is a major sect in Korea as well, but it seems like in North America we encountered it in its Japanese form in most cases. That practice, at least the way that it's practiced in North America, is extremely meditation focused, more so than all the other forms of Buddhism, and tends to be quite austere in its meditation practice, very serious, then the Tibetan Buddhism, just sort of like a completely different animal, is a really colorful tradition with all sorts of diverse practices and sects and frameworks, just even within itself. So it's not like there's one Tibetan Buddhism. But Tibetan Buddhism is a type of Buddhism that incorporates, much more so, I think, than any other traditions, a lot of body practices and energy practices, working with deities, because it's a form of Mahayana. So there's a lot of deities and bodhisattvas and Buddhas and so forth. But this is the place to go if you're interested in things like energy work and chakra cultivation, and sort of like how that connects with meditation and Buddhist practice. It's really primary, that's kind of like what Tibetan Buddhism is really known for.
It is,
among other things, but that's one kind of. It's not unique to Tibetan Buddhism, because you do find that in certain.
But it's on the poster cover. Let's put it that way.
Like
what you're describing with body work practices, like having done Shaolin Kung Fu, you don't get to that level, like what Tibetan Buddhism says openly, until you're like high level of Shaolin. And even then, they'll give you the hints of it, I find. They're like, well, it's this poem. I'm like, really? Thanks. I've been doing horse dance for how long now? But it's with Tibetan, they're a little more straightforward on that point, I find.
Yeah, I think that's been somewhat controversial, because they used to keep it a lot more. The traditions used to keep it a lot more under wraps, and now Tibetan teachers are teaching things pretty openly, like you said. Yeah, for better or worse, that's the kind of the cat's out of the bag with a lot of those practices. So I've got 4 so far: Theravada, Mahayana, Zen, and Tibetan Buddhism, and then the 5th that I talk about in the book, just to kind of orient yourself to, is something that scholars call Buddhist Modernism, and I don't know if it if it necessarily makes any sense to a regular reader to hear that word, but this is the category of Buddhisms that are framing the teachings and framing the practice in either completely or almost completely secular ways. So Buddhism, if you hear the line that Buddhism is a philosophy or a way of life, and the Buddha was a great philosopher and psychologist and had a lot of insight into the human mind that is now being verified by science, and you can practice, meditation in this Buddhist style in order to understand better your psychology and to do things like stress reduction and improve your health outcomes, that's a Buddhist modernist kind of interpretation of Buddhism. So here, you don't find deities, you don't find you don't find that
You have archetypes.
rebirth.
You have archetypes on that.
Yeah. I mean, you don't find rebirth and karma, and a lot of times, a lot of times secular Buddhists aren't even talking about enlightenment or awakening either. They're just talking about stress reduction and health outcomes and so forth. This is a modern form of Buddhism. It's not Western. It's not correct to call that a Western form of Buddhism. It's a global form of Buddhism, because you find Buddhist modernists, to various degrees all over the planet. And some of those trends started in places like Japan and Myanmar and so forth. So it's another. So all 5 of these forms of Buddhism are now global, practiced all over the world by all kinds of different people. And so consequently, you walk into the bookstore and you want to learn something about Buddhism, and you reach for the bookshelf, right? You've got it's a crapshoot what you pull down. Which book are you pulling down? If you pull down the book by, the Dalai Lama, you're getting Tibetan Buddhism with a little bit maybe of a secular spin. If you pull down a book by Stephen Batchelor, you're getting a totally secular form of Buddhist modernism. You pull down a book by Jack Kornfield, you may be getting a Theravada thing. You pull down a book by on and on and on. You don't know what you're getting. I think the one that's the least popular in sort of the bookstores in America is Mahayana Buddhism.
Yes.
But that's by far the most practiced form of Buddhism at least in the US, because this is the form of Buddhism that's practiced by the vast majority of immigrants to the US from Asia. So I did a sort of a survey of Buddhist temples here in Philadelphia, and they were represented as all the forms of Buddhism here in Philly, but by far the most was the Chinese and Vietnamese and Korean Mahayana Buddhist temples. So it's just interesting, kind of then I'll stop talking after I make this point. But it's interesting.
This is great information. I'm loving it. So
all right, good. Well, it's just interesting the way that these forms of Buddhism have sort of come into North America with these sort of trends, right? After the World War II with Japan, suddenly Zen sort of became really, really popular. When Tibet was invaded by the Chinese military, then Tibetan Buddhism became really popular, right? After the Vietnam War, then Theravada Buddhism started to become more popular. These days, secular Buddhist modernism is kind of the kind of most sort of popular in terms of popular media and the press and so forth. Meanwhile, Mahayana has been the most commonly practiced in North America all along, and it's just kind of a little bit under the radar because it's primarily being practiced by people who aren't necessarily writing books in English and making a big splash in popular media. So.
It is true about that. With Mahayana, I'd say that's my background on things. But shit, I started in Shaolin Kung Fu. It doesn't get more Mahayana than that, right? So it's even from those practices, it is interesting because you see a lot of the, at least East Asian population. Again, it's not going to be in English. There's plenty of literature if you read a secondary language, or a primary language such as Chinese, Japanese, or Korean, right? And it just doesn't get outside the ethnic community on that. Yeah. And then, they're very welcome. They're pretty much just come on in. There's food, right? But
food.
But who doesn't want food? But it's one of these things where unless you're engaged with the culture now, you're not going to know of that. And I think this is important with at least different types of Buddhism. It's are you not paradigm shifting, but are you even engaging with the culture? Because a lot of the practices with the folk magic side of things, or even just the meditation side of things, you see this right in the culture. So I could talk to most Chinese people, and they're like, yeah, you just meditate. You're like, how do you even know meditate? It's a thing, as an overall cultural thing. Whether or not they do it or not, they know of it. That's how ingrained it is, I thought.
Yeah. Just 2 points to make real quick, and one of them is like back to like how I got into the field and
Yeah.
so forth. This is actually one of the major reasons I went into Chinese Buddhism, specifically Mahayana. Was because at the time, like I said, Strickmann's book came out. I got really jazzed up about it.
Yeah.
But at the time, there were lots of people, even at the University of Virginia where I was, there were a lot of people studying Tibetan Buddhism. And I had just come from the Theravada Buddhist world, and I knew about all this sort of, meditation centers and so forth. And for me, the kind of just becoming aware of Chinese Mahayana through Strickland's book just really kind of like opened my eyes to a whole kind of tradition that was really unknown to me and got me really excited about learning. So I wanted to say that. And then the other thing I was going to say was what was it? See, we're live, so I can't edit it out. So
Well, it's all right. I mean, it's.
I was gonna say
It'll
something else. So it'll come back. Yeah.
They'll come back. I think this is where, again, it's like, at least from my perspective, again, we're always big about like getting to engage the culture. No matter what paradigm you're in, know where it's coming from, because it's going to have an influence on you. Like last week, we were having a conversation on Afro-Caribbean things, and it's saying like those particular cultures, they have to get external results because there was, the colonial background to that. So if you're working in that environment, those results magically made a difference, and that's how you brought community together. And that's why they have like these big meals, because a sacrifice of a pig or things like that was a meal for the community, right, when there was not much going on. So it's things like this where it kind of gives you an in where there's academic research side of things, but I would say at least talk to someone from the culture. Just like level to them and just be like, let's have a coffee. Let me understand what your culture is, because you'll get a better understanding of what that magical system does at that point. At least where its values stand to some degree.
Yeah. I remember what I was going to say. So what I was going to respond to earlier, also, related to that, is just your comment about how sort of Buddhist techniques like meditation are just kind of diffused within the Chinese culture, right? And I, that's something that as scholars we kind of sort of push back against what essentially is a Christian, or maybe it's like a kind of European Middle Eastern kind of idea that you can you have to be an adherent of one religion at a time, right? And when you're an adherent of one religion, that you must not dabble in things from other religions because that's somehow like blasphemous or inappropriate. So that concept, I mean, there definitely are some people and some texts in historically, some times where that kind of purity was more prevalent in others, but for the most part, at the popular sort of culture level in China, for Chinese cultural diaspora as well, for most of history, freely intermix Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, as well as whatever local kind of like spirit traditions and magic and healing and so forth. Just freely mixed in all kinds of ways. So the borrowing back and forth between all of these traditions of practices, not to mention also the borrowing of practices across cultural boundaries with neighboring cultures has been sort of like,
there's a huge thing. It's like, even
like a
I'm
free
not
for
be
all.
able to pronounce the Sanskrit on this, but Guanyin was initially a male in Hinduism, or at least the Indic versions of influence for Buddhism, and then it turned to a female. You're like, really? Okay, well, this is definitely a Sino concept. Now, what's happening with the transformation? Why did it adapt this way, right? From one personification to another.
Yeah.
And that's a whole interesting story by itself. When you think
Yeah. So I won't get the details right, but there's a book called Guanyin, written by
I know which book you're talking about, but I can't remember the author.
Jun Yufang. And she argues, or she like lays out the whole history of that, where essentially, this male bodhisattva from India, which is also found in Hinduism and other Indic religions, but is the male bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara in India, is introduced to China, is actually male for a while, but then undergoes this transformation by synthesizing or syncretizing or hybridizing the Indian bodhisattva with a local folk goddess in southeastern China, who was like kind of like the protector of the ocean, the protector of the
Yeah,
seas.
but that's Mao Shan and Maju, right? So
Yeah. So like, that's a great example of this kind of like cross-cultural borrowing and remaking and hybridization. That's my whole shtick as a scholar. Like that's what I study is like how particularly medical or healing techniques cross those boundaries and get reinterpreted, translated and reinterpreted, or you could say adopted and adapted, right? It constantly in between China and other cultures. That's kind of my main focal point as a scholar. So I've written a lot of stuff on that in terms of medical practices, healing practices, rituals, etc.
yeah, I mean, we can have a whole side conversation on like medical practices with mantras, dharnis, and all that other stuff, right?
Oh,
But
yeah. I would just to just throw something in too, because
Yeah.
you've mentioned a couple times now, sort of like paradigm shifts or like getting like embedded in a cultural paradigm and so forth.
Yeah.
So I mean, one thing that's interesting to me that I kind of pay attention to in these transactions or these exchanges that I'm talking about, is a lot of times kind of like ritual technologies or material culture or like specific objects or specific kind of like,
Yes.
chants or other kind of ingredients are kind of like extracted out of, you could say, the source culture or the source paradigm, and are sort of like fit into a new cultural paradigm or a new linguistic kind of context, where they're doing something completely different in the new context than they were in the old context, right? And so I'm interested in those instances where that's happening, but then I'm also interested in the instances where the whole paradigm comes along with it, right? And so you have like, in medieval China, you have these cases where, medieval Chinese writers, so I'm reading their texts, and they're kind of like grappling with these ideas from India and these models of, health or healing or whatever, and trying to figure out like, how does this fit with what we do in China? Like, is it gonna does it just like translate directly into Chinese medicine, or is it something different that we need to, accommodate this new paradigm? And so it's really interesting that this kind of dilemma that we have today with cross-cultural exchange and borrowing and appropriation and all of that, I see it in the text from 1500 years ago.
Absolutely.
They're grappling with the same exact issues.
And it's like, especially like, I'll bring up one particular text. I can't remember the name of it, but generally it was in China. They were using this as a Buddhist astrology technique specifically, but it's been the Picatrix in Greece, and it went through India. So they have to put the whole lunar nodes in there being Rahu and Ketu, and the Chinese are like, we don't have an equivalent to this. We can put the elements to the other planets. This makes sense, but this we have no clue. And you see that translation where they're trying to grapple with it, and then they put in a Taoist take on it because that's what's made of. And I find that hilarious because you could literally look at the scriptures between like the text, I think in particular the Han Dynasty, when that transmission was happening, and they're like literally looking at Taoists and saying like, okay, this is what they're doing. How do we adapt it to the culture now when we don't use those specific terms?
Yeah. So I don't know too much about astrology, but you might be talking about the work of Jeffrey Kotick. I'm not exactly sure how to say his last name.
I can't recall the author, but yeah,
it's
there's
KYOTI.
It sounds familiar. It might be. Yeah.
IK, I think. Anyway,
like
he's a Canadian scholar, recent PhD, who's written a number of things on sort of exactly that kind of Near Eastern, Persian, Chinese kind of like nexus of astrological borrowings, and KOTYK. I think it's just that. Yeah. Anyway, somebody to have on this series of talks here, because he'd be really interesting to talk to.
It would be interesting, but it's just funny how it's like in the native culture, it's that source paradigm. It's like, okay, we have this, and how does this translate here? And everyone's just kind of grappling, and I don't want to say drawing straws, but it is this like, well, how do we make this work in whatever the values of that culture is, and adapting those technologies?
I mean, I just like to think about how similar that is to what we're doing today. Like
Absolutely.
the difference is we're doing it much faster today. Like you can get more and more and more information to assimilate into your new synthesis today, right? Just go online and there's constantly new stuff, pouring in. And that kind of thing took, hundreds of years to get information back in the, first millennium. But a lot of the dynamics are really similar to today, right? Where initial borrowings of material kind of like tend to misunderstand the material and fit it into whatever we're already doing, right? So we just kind of like appropriate things and fit it into what we're doing. And then there's kind of like a let's go back and look at it. We get more information from the source culture. We go back and we kind of refine those ideas, and then suddenly, those ideas take on more kind of fidelity to the original source, and they start to push back against our ideas, and then we have to grapple with like, well, which paradigm is right? And yeah, I mean, there's so much of that happening right now with the adoption in North America of Asian medicine, Asian religions, meditation techniques, martial arts, across the board. And it's really this process, it has such a long history, these kinds of cross-cultural exchanges. I find that to be fascinating myself, and I learn a lot by looking at what people did 1,500 years ago, and then looking at what people are doing today and seeing sort of
just being like, no, it's kind of the same. So so with that said, Pierce, is there any events, anything you're doing coming up, any new publications? I know this is the newest one, obviously, but is there anything else you got on the docket coming up that people can look into?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say if anybody's super interested in like Buddhist healing magic specifically, is to look at a book I published in 2017, which is an edited volume. It's super expensive, so don't buy it. But you can find the chapters kind of like around online. It's one of those academic books that are only made in hardcover for library purchases, so it's not accessible price. But anyway, in that book, 2017 book, it's called an anthology, Buddhism and Medicine anthology, and that book has 62 chapters of translations of texts that were done by me and a whole team of other scholars, and a good chunk of those relate to Buddhist healing rituals and magical practices, and give instructions on how to do them and the implements that you need to do them and so forth. It's just the tip of the iceberg, but it'll give you a sense of the kind of the flavor of the materials. In terms of upcoming stuff, I have another book coming up, which is an edited volume with another few scholars on sort of modern contemporary Buddhist medicine. That should be coming out maybe a year from now or so. And the other big news is I'll be starting a podcast. So interviewing scholars about their work in the field of Buddhism and medicine. So if that's something people are interested in following, I don't have any details about it right now, but you can maybe just look at my website or find me on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and you'll keep informed.
Good. So with that said, thank you, Pierce, for popping on today. For listeners, again, we do have our sponsor shows on every other Sunday. We are going to finish up the Crown Chakra tomorrow, and then from there, we're going to work on Western elementals, elemental forces. Then we're going to get into a deep dive with the tarot. So with that, all the fun stuff. So if you become a sponsor, $40 a month or so, you get almost 2.5, 3 years worth of access materials with rituals and workshops. And then you get access to our physical library, which has 700 books and more. So with that, we have plenty of stuff happening. Also, sponsors get to see our co-op programs when we actually start doing different potions, herbs, incenses, that type of things that we build for the store directly. So if you're a sponsor, you can see that live, online or in person. Obviously, since we're in a medical facility, you have to wear a mask and we have to do a temp check. But past that, that's all the announcements. Andrieh will be back with us next week on Taoist magic specifically. So this is going to be a fun conversation because Buddhism, Taoism, I love it. So we have that. So check out those details next week. We are moving that show up because it is going to be on a London time for our interviewee. So it will be at 11:30 a.m. our time, but it's going to be 4:30 p.m. their time. So with that, stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.